Okay, critical reasoning. Whenever we deal with critical reasoning, the first thing we want to do is identify the type of critical reasoning question that we're dealing with. Strengthens, weakens, inference, evaluate the argument or plan, boldface, or paradox. This question in particular is dealing with inference. And you can easily identify an inference question based on the prompt. It'll say something like, which of the following must be true if the statements above are true, or if the passage above is true, or which of the following would the author of the passage above most likely agree with. And it will never you will never see the word argument in the prompt because it doesn't have a conclusion. And that's how you know it's an inference question, because they want you to take the information and infer a conclusion. Couple things you have to do with inference questions. One, you have to, rule number one, most important rule, stay within the specifics of the passage. I'm talking down to the literal words in the passage. Don't go outside of the scope of that passage. They're going to try to include in the answer choices a lot of things that you think should be there in the passage. Like, yes, that makes sense. But no, stay within the specifics of the passage. A couple things to watch out for. They like to do something like I call the scope within a scope. So if you're staying within the specifics of the passage, right, they tell you about, let's say, they'll tell you about trains and trains in Pennsylvania. Then they'll say, some of the trains in Pennsylvania will do this, right? They're telling you not just now you're getting into a detail to call the scope within a scope. And if the passage doesn't give you that kind of information, that's the wrong answer. So they like to do that a lot because it seems like they're telling you that in the passage, but they're not. Watch out for that. Watch out for percentages versus numbers. Sometimes in the passage, they're dealing with percentages. Well, then in the answer choices, you better deal with percentages. If they're in the passage, they're dealing with numbers, then you don't want to worry about proportions. So that's what you have to watch out for, because they like to talk about percentages in the passage, but numbers in the answer choices. So watch out for that. And also, just a rule of thumb, when you're dealing with inference questions, softer language is better. So if you're trying to come to a conclusion, the broader your conclusion, the easier it is to come to that conclusion. So words like may, probably, could, look for those kind of words in the answer choices. This question says, if the statements above are true, which of the following must also be true on the basis of them? Statements above, so which of the following must be true? We're dealing with inference question. So that's from 1980 to 1989, total consumption of fish in the country of Germania increased by 4.5%. Total consumption of poultry products increased by 9%. During the same period, the population of Germania increased by 6%, in part due to immigration to Germania from other countries in the region. Okay, we're dealing with inference. We have to stay specific to the passage. First, total consumption of fish increased by 4.5%. Total consumption of poultry increased by 9%. And the population of Germania increased by 6%. Okay, so what kind of conclusion can we come to? First thing we got to note, we're dealing with percentages, so stay in percentages, and we're dealing with consumption of fish, consumption of poultry. So the answer choice A. During the 1980s in Germania, profits of wholesale distributors, all right, so already we know we're outside of the scope of the passage, because in the passage does not talk about profits at all. A is out. B says, for people who immigrated to Germania during the 1980s, fish was less likely to be a major part of their diet than poultry. Okay, so here's what I mean by the scope within a scope. It does say that the population of Germania increased by 6%, in part due to immigration to Germania from other countries in the region. But we don't know anything else about the people who immigrated to Germania. This answer is telling us about the people who immigrated, and we can't determine that based on the information. So that's the scope within a scope. The first scope, it talks about the population increasing in some part due to immigration, so you know some people moved to Germania. But the answer choice, the scope within a scope, is telling us about the people who immigrated. We don't know that based on the passage. B is out. C says in 1989, Germanians consume twice as much poultry as fish. Here's an example of percentages versus numbers. We know that consumption of fish and consumption of poultry increased by 4.5% and 9% respectively. We don't know what those numbers actually mean. because the number that increased by 4.5% may not be half as the number that increased by 9%. So we don't know the actual number, so that's out. D says for a significant portion of Geranian's population, both fish and poultry products were a regular part of the diet during the 1980s. Do we know anything else about the diet? We just know total consumption of fish and poultry. We don't know anything about diet, and we don't know about the significant portion of Geranian's population. So D is out. E says per capita consumption of fish in Gerania was lower in 1989 than in 1980. Okay, per capita consumption, so per person. So now this is telling me the population of Gerania increased by 6%, and within that same time period, the consumption of fish increased by 4.5%. So yes, in 1989, the consumption of fish per person was lower than it was in 1980 because in that period you have a growth of 6% in the population, but only a growth of 4.5%. And we're dealing with percentages again in the answer choice, so that's why E would be correct.